Very pleased to have Dr. Jane Arrington here this evening. And Dr. Arrington is an historian at Queen's and also at RMC. And throughout a long period of her career, she has also delved into the emergence of this part of Canada, and the Victorian era. And so she is well versed with, of course, everything in the Kingston area. And I want to welcome her. And she is going to do an introduction to Victoria. Dr. Arrington?
I never know where the unmute and mute is. Thank you very much, Vincent. And thank you to everybody who's here, which is lovely. I think we're going to be in for a treat. And I was delighted to have the opportunity to introduce Victoria to you. I've known Victoria since she came to Queen's to do a PhD, which is 4 and a bit years ago. She arrived from Brock, where she had just finished her MA in history, and she had a Bachelor Honors degree in history and classics. And she arrived with outstanding academic record, and I mean really outstanding. And I was soon discovered how well deserved that record was. I'm Victoria's supervisor, one of her supervisors. The other one is Cecilia Morgan, and we are delighted to be working with her. It really is a wonderful experience. When Victoria initially planned to come to Queen's, she put forward the idea that she wanted to look at the new woman. Which is this sort of, image of what the new woman at the end of the 19th century was supposed to look like and supposed to be, and she was supposed to be new. But by the end of her first year, she had actually decided to move back in time. And I must say I was personally delighted, because she's now in a period that I'm certainly much more familiar with and think is as exciting as the period of the new woman. She wants to look at the world of Harriet Cartwright. And she's never looked back from that. Now, I'm not sure how Victoria would describe herself. I know when I asked her what I should say tonight, she said, keep it short, tell them that I'm a 4th-year doctoral student. I work in women and gender studies in the British world, and I'm going to talk about Harriet Cartwright. Well, I have one thing that I want to add, at least one thing, and that she is an exceptional individual. And I expect that she's also an exceptional teacher. This year, she's a teaching fellow at Queen's, and we spend some time talking about teaching and students and the delights of teaching on Zoom, which I must say for all of us is at times wearing, but I suspect Victoria more than makes it work, because her enthusiasm for her topic, her enthusiasm for Harriet Cartwright is, I suspect, infectious. And I think we'll see that tonight. And Victoria, it's now over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. E. I'd like to start off too by thanking everyone here tonight, thanking the Kingston Historical Society for inviting me here to speak, thanking you for setting this whole thing up, connecting me to the Historical Society, and thanking Duncan McDowell for all his organization and putting up with me. This talk has been a long time coming, because I was supposed to give it about a year ago. Pandemic kind of got in the way. Broken knee got in the way as well. So it's been an exciting year, I think, for everyone. This presentation is basically a mini version of my thesis, which will eventually become a biography of Harriet Dobbs Cartwright. So what you're hearing today is the very beginning of my writing process. I'm just working on the first chapters. I'm figuring out where the holes in my research are. Can everyone see the slide? Yes, okay, good. So I'm just figuring out kind of where I'm going and how I'm going to get there. This presentation focuses on the period between 1832 and 1845, which is a very significant period in Harriet Cartwright's life. She became a wife, emigrated to Upper Canada, became a mother, and established herself as a pillar of the upper class Kingston community. There was also This is also the period that I have the most documentation for her life. Harriet Dobbs was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1808 to Conway Dobbs and Maria Sophia Dobbs. The Dobbs were an upper middle class Irish family, and they were also Anglican, which is very important. Her father Conway was a barrister and the family had money. Harriet's mother Maria is also the only reason that I can write this paper, as she carefully copied and preserved the letters from Harriet and her other daughters into what is now known as the Cartwright Letter Book. This massive tome, over 800 pages of text, is currently stored at the Queen's Archives, as are many of the other texts which I've consulted for this paper. As a youth, Harriet received an education that reflected her class and included instruction in literature, language, history, and art, as well as regular lessons on religious devotion. Some of these early lessons in Christianity, combined with her close relationship with a charismatic Anglican minister, not the minister she would eventually marry, led her to embrace the evangelical movement. She experienced her own conversion in her youth. This movement was a type of belief that she would sustain for her whole life and would influence her actions. Though Harriet experienced an evangelical conversion, she was still very much an Anglican who held many upper class views. Harriet married in 1832 to Upper Canadian clergyman Reverend Robert David Cartwright. Robert and Harriet had known each other for a while. Now, this is why I included a bit of a family tree here, because it gets a little confusing. Robert's sister Mary was married to Harriet's uncle, who served in the British military and was stationed in Kingston. When Harriet's uncle died in 1828, Mary Cartwright Dobbs, again Robert's sister, traveled to Dublin to stay with the Dobbs family to grieve. And so her brothers, Robert and John, accompanied her. Robert came up with several excuses to stay in Dublin for an extended period of time. So the Dobbs family was well acquainted with Robert when he proposed to Harriet in 1831. Initially, Robert's proposal was declined by Harriet's father, as he was unsure that Robert had the financial ability to support a wife and family properly. Harriet's sister Jane had written letters also to discourage this engagement, because there was a lot of concern that if Harriet went to Upper Canada, the family would never see her again because it was so far. This is ironic considering the fact that Jane was in India at the time with her husband. Despite the cautioning of her family, Harriet and Robert wed in Dublin in 1832. Just for some background information, the Cartwright family was a big deal in Upper Canada. Many of you may have encountered the Cartwrights in your own research endeavors, as the family was very prominent, not just in Kingston, but more broadly in Upper Canada and eventually in Canada. Robert's father, Richard Cartwright, was actually born in the States, but was forced to move to Upper Canada due to his British sympathies during the American Revolution. He then became an extremely prominent loyalist, owning large amounts of land, investing in industry, and even becoming a well-respected judge. He died when Robert and John were quite young and left each of his twin sons an inheritance of $10,000, an enormous amount of land to their names. But Robert and John were not always the most fiscally prudent, and they made several poor investments, and Robert was always giving money away to the poor because he felt that was his duty to the community. So the Dobbs family's concerns were not unfounded about Robert's financial situation, because he had money, but he never kept money. Robert had an appointment as the minister of St. George's Anglican Church and frequently preached to British troops who were stationed in Kingston. But this in itself did not pay well at all. In fact, the congregation frequently struggled to pay his salary. His twin brother John was a lawyer and eventually became a judge and a member of the provincial legislature. So his twin brother John had a much larger income than Robert, which was also at times a point of contention. Harriet and Robert's journey to Upper Canada after their wedding took about a year because they took a while to meander through England on their honeymoon. They sailed from Liverpool and landed in New York eventually. Upon arrival in Kingston, Harriet faced a place that was so similar and yet so different than Dublin. She noted that the weather was quite familiar, not nearly as bad as people had led her to believe. The amenities were also not as lacking as she thought they would be. There was a church and there was society. But Harriet also wrote to her family slightly annoyed that Robert had misled her about his housing situation. Robert had promised her a fully functional household. What she actually got was a house that didn't have plates or spoons or the ability to function really as a home. Because the household was not set up, Robert and Harriet had to go next door to John's house, his twin, and eat every meal there. Though Harriet was already acquainted with John, and she quickly grew to appreciate John's wife, Sarah, she was not pleased that Robert had misled her about what she was getting into. It is also important to remember that in this early period, Harriet identified as a British woman living in the colonies. But this was complicated by her continuing identification and ties with Ireland. She was a member of the upper class and an evangelical Anglican. This separated Harriet completely from some of the other Irish immigrants to Upper Canada at this time, who were frequently Catholic and underprivileged. Harriet was constantly negotiating these various identities, which influenced and informed how she viewed the poor and her own place in society. One thing that becomes apparent about Harriet when reading her letters is her pragmatic nature. She had no interest in wasting time with pleasantries or social conventions, preferring to devote her time to prayer and good works. After the initial shock, it appears that Kingston society accepted that Harriet would not be attending balls or doing a lot of polite visiting. And it was through her volunteering that Harriet really found her place in Canada. Immediately upon her arrival to Upper Canada, Harriet became involved in various volunteering communities in Kingston, and there were many. Her husband, Robert, was already involved in benevolent work. For example, on Wednesdays, he taught young people to read and write. Harriet accompanied him most of the time, and only a few months after her arrival, she was already organizing a separate group for young ladies to study scripture together. This also served as a much-needed social group for the young women of Kingston upper class. She also started a women's sewing group, which sold their wares and donated the proceeds to support the poor of the community. Robert's work greatly influenced Harriet's, and if I dare say, vice versa was also true. Robert spent Monday and Tuesday afternoons visiting the hospital and the jail, as the Kingston Pen had just opened and required a minister for the moral guidance of the prisoners. Robert's involvement with the hospitals and the prisons opened the door for much of Harriet's work. All of these commitments took Harriet away from her home and her family for large periods of time each day. In 1834, Harriet wrote to her closest friend, Marianne Martley, who lived still in Dublin, about the apprehensions that seemed to have arisen at home, that I may be doing too much and neglecting home duties. I do not wish to be misunderstood, but I know that both by myself and by others, much time is squandered on frivolous and vain pursuits or in shapeless idleness that may well be redeemed for more useful occupations. This is also just my favorite quote from all of her letters, just my absolute favorite. I think you get a real hint of her personality here. This quote is a demonstration of how Harriet viewed volunteering, religion, and home duties. Her devotion to the evangelical religious movement took her away from the home and the family, which she found in some ways less fulfilling than her voluntary pursuits. Luckily for Harriet, she had her sisters-in-law, Mary and Sarah, who took on most of the household and the eventual child-rearing responsibilities, so that she could be involved in the community. This was a type of socially accepted rebellion in some ways. She frequently used her devotion to the Lord to escape her domestic and social obligations. Not to say that her religious devotion was fake, it just suited her own purposes and passions in life. And there are a number of causes that were particularly important to Harriet, including the hospital, the penitentiary, and what would become the insane asylum. All of these institutions, even in the early days of their creation, provided important, though flawed, services to the Kingston community. One of the most lasting effects of Harriet's volunteering is the foundation of the Kingston General Hospital. I'd also like to note that there are so many women who were central to this, and their labor should not in any way be diminished. Because of that, I would like to take a minute to rewind and provide some background information about the hospital before Harriet's arrival. I'd also like to acknowledge my debt to Dr. Margaret Angus, a former Queen's archivist, whose work on the history of KGH has been invaluable to me, and more generally for my thesis as well. She was just amazing. And she also used to live in one of Harriet's houses. The quest for a local hospital began in 1817 when the Kingston Compassionate Society was established to provide aid privately to the immigrant, sick, and poor. Middle and upper class women who had free time were not permitted to work for monetary gain in the public sphere, but they were allowed to work for free if it was good works. Women's charitable activities were widespread in the 19th century. It was one of the ways that women could subvert the gendered expectations of propriety. The Kingston Compassionate Society was loosely based on the Montreal Ladies Benevolent Society, which was already running a house of recovery or a hospital at the time. Within 6 months, the Kingston Compassionate Society was already overwhelmed by the amount of people needing aid, and they quickly recognized that it was not just new immigrants who were sick, but many Kingston residents as well. In 1818, the magistrates granted several lots of land for the building of a hospital, but a year later, the government discontinued providing funds for aiding the poor, once again putting the onus on private groups. The Compassionate Society opened a single room as a temporary hospital, which was operated seasonally. In early 1821, the Kingston Compassionate Society was reformed into the Female Benevolent Society, whose mandate was to visit the sick, poor, inquire into their circumstances, administer necessary relief, and endeavor to stir up industry, method, neatness, and economy. So the purpose of this new organization went far beyond healing the physical body. It was concerned with total self-improvement and reformation of character. Morality and health went hand in hand. The women of the Female Benevolent Society were responsible for founding, funding, and running the hospital in Kingston for more than 20 years. Over the years, the physical location changed from an old blockhouse to an empty brewery warehouse to an actual building built with the intention for operating as a hospital. So this whole project came from rather humble roots. At first, the hospital operated seasonally and relied on retired and half-pay military surgeons who donated their time and expertise free of charge. This included Dr. James Sampson, one of the most well-known surgeons in 19th century Kingston. In 1827, the women of the Female Benevolent Society were running out of funds as donations from the community dried up. They were forced to restrict the number of people admitted. By 1829, some of the prominent men of Kingston applied for government grants on behalf of the Female Benevolent Society because the women were not permitted to do so themselves. And in 1831, there was an agreement in a public meeting that a public hospital was necessary for the community. The Female Benevolent Society continued to petition the legislature for funds and also collected subscriptions from the Kingston community to provide additional support. And in 1832, they were finally awarded a rather large grant to aid in the building of a hospital. But as many of you know, in 1832, that summer was a cholera epidemic, which halted any progress as the city scrambled to deal with the immediate emergency. This is when Harriet arrived in Upper Canada and became involved in the Female Benevolent Society. The Female Benevolent Society had already been operating a hospital for a while out of a blockhouse. Harriet was impressed with the upper class women running the institution. She was a little judgmental of the clientele, though. As an upper class woman, it was not unusual for Harriet to be involved with such voluntary activities. In 1835, Kingston finally built its hospital. Unfortunately, that same year, the hospital burnt down in a massive fire that destroyed a significant part of Kingston. This fire, where one person in the hospital died, also took with it all the Female Benevolent Society's materials and funds that were stored within it. Harriet was involved with the revitalization project that followed, particularly with fundraising and organizational management. She was also one of the visitors who went to actually meet with the poor families and learn about their housing, their finances, and most importantly, their religious affiliations. Though the hospital was open to all denominations, there was a heavy favoring to Protestants, in particular to Anglicans, as the women of the Female Benevolent Society were all Protestants and mostly Anglican. Even before the fire, the blockhouse hospital was already overcrowded, as there were so many immigrants who were in desperate need of any type of aid. Harriet notes that most of these immigrants were Irish Roman Catholics who were impoverished and subjected to typical racial and religious profiling of the time. Now, it's important to remember that Harriet's identity as an upper-class Irish Anglican woman definitely had an influence on how she viewed poverty and illness, and the people who she was committed to help. She was extremely bigoted against Catholicism and associated it with poverty and the lower classes. The comment about these impoverished people being half barbarous in appearance and manner indicates her low opinion of the people she was serving at the hospital. She was probably not the only one of this opinion in the Female Benevolent Society, considering it was an organization run by women of similar class standing. In the late 1830s, Harriet was also explained in her letters home to Ireland how the Female Benevolent Society planned on funding and rebuilding and running the hospital. Instead of collecting funds from the community, the women managed to take the issue to the legislature, which voted and agreed to pay for rent for a hospital under the care of the women. Harriet herself took on the role of secretary of the hospital, which was a continuation of her management and visitation role, which she had begun much earlier. Here again, it is clear that these women were involved in every aspect of this hospital. Finally, in 1845, the Kingston General Hospital was opened officially as a charity hospital. This was an amazing feat, largely thanks to the women of the Female Benevolent Society, who had once again appealed for government aid. The same year, the Sisters of the Hotel Dieu opened the Hotel Dieu Hospital, which was a Catholic charity hospital only a few blocks away from the Protestant-run KGH. Those of you who've been in Kingston know they're literally just a hop, skip, and a jump away. So it's important to remember that there was this whole other group of charity-minded women who were running a similar charity and also trying to create a hospital just to cater to the sick and poor of the Catholic community. The general management of KGH was in the hands of the directress of the Female Benevolent Society, and the day-to-day work was done by various volunteer visitors. Harriet was listed as the #1 visitor of the hospital at the time. The women of the Female Benevolent Society continued to run the hospital full-time for several years. This was an increasingly difficult thing to do during the typhus epidemic in 1847, when waves and waves of deathly ill immigrants, particularly from Ireland, arrived on Kingston shores. It's important to note that through the entire 3 decades that it took to establish the KGH hospital, it was women who were primarily responding to the needs of the poor and the sick during healthcare emergencies. Officially in 1849, only 4 years after it opened, the Female Benevolent Society stepped down for the daily affairs of the hospital. An official committee of men was appointed to take their place. Once the state took over running the hospital, the efforts of these women were largely obscured and overlooked. And we see similar things happening all across Ontario at the time. Carmen Nielsen has a book on something very similar happening in Hamilton, Ontario, which is also where I am right now, and I highly recommend her work. If you look at the Kingston General Hospital website, you will see a brief mention of the Female Benevolent Society's role in the history of the hospital, but it's just a cursory nod, which doesn't do justice to the amount of labor and lobbying that occurred to make this hospital happen. And this is copied straight from the website. I tried to take a screenshot, couldn't figure out how to do it, so I just copy and pasted. The Cartwright family, as I mentioned earlier in this paper, was also very close to Dr. James Sampson, one of the main physicians involved with the hospital. In 1835, he was also appointed to work at the new provincial penitentiary, Kingston Pen. Between Robert's volunteering at the penitentiary, which he did on a weekly basis, and Dr. Sampson's role as the primary surgeon there, Harriet was drawn into this world of punishment and rehabilitation. Like in the case of the hospital, there's important background information on the penitentiary and the asylum, which informs Harriet's involvement and the impact that these people and places had on the Kingston community. The Kingston Pen was built between 1833 and 34 and officially opened in the summer of 1835. The foundational philosophy was heavily influenced by prisons in the United States. Shortly after opening, there were already issues with the prison. And one of these major issues with all 19th century penitentiaries, including the Kingston Pen, was funding. Prison labor became important, and in some cases controversial. Prisoners were expected to provide productive labor in this period, and through this labor, the prisoners were expected to become morally reformed, just like good Protestants. And this was in a way to fund the prison. Prisoner laborers work for free, but the money goes to the prison. There were plenty of non-working prisoners, though, the sick, both mentally and physically, and the disabled, both physically and intellectually. As a state response to deviance and crime, the penitentiary played a key role in the regulation of both impoverished and working class people whose behavior was outside the social norm. Penitentiary labor was at the heart of this response, providing discipline and reminding the working class of the dangers of misbehaving. The intention was, at the beginning of the penitentiary, to make the institution in itself self-sustaining. In many cases, this prison labor had serious effects, causing mental, physical injury, and disability, and sometimes even death. There were many different types of mentally ill people in prison in this period, and many prisoners lapsed into mental illness while incarcerated. There were also prisoners who were seen as mentally unfit to stand trial. Prison was the only place to put those who were considered the dangerous insane. But these mentally ill people caused issues within the prison, as they were frequently disruptive and unable to work. In the 1850s, some of these insane were sent to the first provincial lunatic asylum, which was located in Toronto. There was some back and forth. Was it going to be in Toronto? Was it going to be in Kingston? Was it going to be in Toronto? Was it going to be in Kingston? It ended up in Toronto, which was very annoying to some of the men of Kingston. Mentally ill patients were originally in the west wing of the Kingston prison, but they were moved temporarily to the basement in 1856. This temporary measure lasted 8 years until Rockwood was opened in 1864. I'll get more to Rockwood Asylum in a minute. The focus of this period for prisons was on moral therapy, but the prison and the asylum that came later frequently failed to provide the fresh air and exercise space required for moral therapy treatments. And the idea of moral therapy was also a very good excuse to force prisoners to provide prison labor in order to mold and reform them into good citizens. It's also important to remember that gender was very important to understanding insanity and criminality. Convict women were perceived as either more morally corrupt than criminal men because they violated natural law, or they must have been innocent and in the wrong circumstances. Men and women were kept separate in the prison and also in the asylum when it was eventually built. It should be noted that Dr. Sampson, who we've talked about again and again here, was accused by a matron of the penitentiary as being overly close to a possible insane woman, Charlotte Reveille. The prison warden and his wife also backed this charge, so Dr. Sampson was in hot water. A commission finally recommended that they create a separate unit for women and a separate unit for the insane. So we've got kind of a controversial character with Dr. Sampson. Class also played an important role in this idea of insanity and criminality, because wealthy families could afford to send their mentally ill family members to private asylums and not subject them to being wards of the state. There was also an issue of those with intellectual disabilities. Although the medical classification of intellectual disability in this era was not exact, penitentiary officials seemed to have a clear idea that these individuals did not belong in penitentiaries. Their status was informally determined by whether they could participate in daily labor. Penitentiary officials often complained that the prisons became a dumping ground for the intellectually disabled. So they were also sent to the asylum once it opened. And it should be noted that in this time, often people who were intellectually disabled, even if they had never committed a criminal act, were sent to prisons because it was the only type of ward of the state situation they could be put into. And often these people were forced into vagrancy if their families couldn't take care of them. In the early 1800s, criminal lunatics was not a specific categorization. Criminals, lunatics, and the poor were all imprisoned together. Separating the poor, the crazy, and criminals was part of an attempt to regain order and control. This division was achieved in Upper Canada through the creation of the penitentiary and an asylum. And it's also, again, important to remember that in this period, there was alienists in what would eventually become psychology and the study of the mind, and these people were trying to establish themselves as professionals, which is why you see asylums starting to pop up around Ontario. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, Harriet's friendship with our controversial Dr. Sampson and her husband Robert's volunteering at the prison led Harriet to become the first regular visitor to the female prisoners at the penitentiary. Horrified by the conditions and the treatment of these women who are confined to tiny cells, forced to clean and do enormous amounts of laundry and mending and other women's labor, and also whipped and facing the same physical punishments as the men, Harriet began to use her class position to advocate for a separate space for the mentally ill, rather than being relegated to a prison. Harriet was not the only person advocating for this separation, but she's the focus of my thesis, so it comes up. The history of the asylum in Kingston is complicated and sometimes contested. This place has gone by many names and had many purposes, especially throughout the 19th century. The Kingston Psychiatric Hospital, Rockwood Lunatic Asylum, and the Penrose were some of the names which this institution held. Though there have been some work done on the early history, it can be difficult to tease out the details and nuances, in part due to privacy concerns and the slog of going through some very dense archival records. I admit my own limitations here. With the pandemic, I am unable to go through some of these records as of yet. The building itself, the Rockwood Estate, was originally owned by John and Sarah Cartwright. This was Harriet's in-laws. The 40-acre estate is right on the shores of Lake Ontario, and it's a great location. And at the time, it was just outside of Kingston, with the city boundaries that existed then. And this prevented people from interacting with or gawking at the patients of the asylum. The Rockwood Estate was rented as a private asylum in 1854, and plans were drawn up for a new criminal lunatic jail in 1856. The same year, the Rockwood Estate was purchased for this purpose. The stables were remodeled for 20 mentally disturbed women who remained there in the east wing of the until the east wing of the new asylum opened in 1868. So you're thinking, yes, 12 years these women lived in the stables. But I've seen pictures of the stables. They were very nice. Early in the planning stage, it was decided, in part by Sir John A. Macdonald and some other important men of the time, that the asylum could not only house the criminally insane, but also the mentally ill, which was a very new distinction at the time, and that convict labor from the nearby penitentiary would be used to build the institution, which is somewhat ironic. Construction began in the fall of 1859, and the association, the close association between the Kingston Pen and Rockwood Asylum went on into the 1870s. So there was always a very close connection between mental illness and criminality. And I mean, we still see that today. The intended occupants of Rockwood changed several times. The issue arose with these new classifications of illness and criminality. There was a growing distinction between those who were incarcerated at the penitentiary who hadn't broken the law, but just needed safekeeping and treatment. There was also serious concerns about the more violent and disturbing insane who would disturb the peace and silence expected in the penitentiary. Inhumanely, for a long time, the people who were considered insane were kept in the basement of the penitentiary. This was due to the fact that there was overcrowding in the prison, and the plans did not include these distinctions and these classes within the prison system. So frankly, the system was overwhelmed. But just because Rockwood Asylum was for the non-criminally insane at the time did not mean that the atmosphere of Rockwood was not prison-like. Despite some idealistic goals, the asylum was often not different than a prison at all. A visitor to the asylum in 1864, Mr. Evans, described the place in very grim terms. The inmates were kept each in his cell, with a prison bucket for his needs, chains for his limbs if he became too troublesome, while his food was passed to him through a great hole in the door, and his nurses were called keepers. This paints a very, very grim picture. So I do have a source, not a primary source, a secondary source that does talk a bit about why the Cartwrights may have been more inclined to be involved in this whole process, seeing as it originally started as a Cartwright estate. At the very beginning of this whole process, there's a source that says that while the women were in the stables, there was a well-to-do gentleman of the Cartwright family whose mind was unsound that lived in the main house. And there was also a small stone cottage on the property which was occupied by another member of the family. So there may have been family members possibly who had fallen into dementia, who were part of the inspiration for kind of pushing more and more for this asylum to be created, because there was no aged care homes at the time. So I'm still trying to sort out some of this because the sources are few and far between. But I think I'm making some progress. You can see that Harriet's involvement as a visitor to both the prison and the asylum, and the Cartwright family's involvement was all quite interesting. But it's only a small part of the history of these interconnected institutions. I would also like to take a minute to note during the period that this is all happening and that Harriet is so outside the home and volunteering, she was also a wife and a sister and a friend and a mother. Her life was not only focused on the outside community. In 1834, Harriet gave birth to her first child, a son she named Conway after her father and possibly her brother, but mostly her father. It was a family name. Robert and Harriet were thrilled by the birth of their first child, and Harriet's letters spell out cautious optimism about the strength and vitality of this little baby. Unfortunately, this child died around the age of 1. Harriet and Robert were actually on a trip to the United States to solidify some important networking opportunities for Robert's career when they received news from Kingston that they needed to come home immediately, that their baby was deathly ill. They rushed home and made it in time to be there for baby Conway's final moments. This was a very bittersweet moment in both their lives as they lost their son, but they were both comforted by their faith and knew that he would be welcomed into the kingdom of God. Harriet and Robert were still completely devastated though, and according to Harriet's letters to her mother, Robert began to pull away emotionally from her. And this was all not helped by the fact that Robert's own health was in rapid decline. He suffered from the same disease that took his infant son's life, consumption. In fact, most of the Cartwrights for several generations suffered from this type of inherited consumption that ended their lives prematurely. Okay, I have done some research on this topic, but I'm not a scientist. I know that I've read papers that have said you can inherit a predilection for consumption, and it ran in the Cartwright line. But I admit my own struggles with understanding these sources. Genetics and the gene pool, kind of not my thing. So in this time with infant loss, Harriet bonded particularly with her sister Jane and even her sister-in-law Sarah, as they were all mothers who'd lost children. When baby Conway passed, Harriet was already pregnant with another child. Shortly afterward, she gave birth to Richard, who would eventually become Sir Richard Cartwright, for those of you who've heard of Laurier's second in command. They were happy to have a healthy child, but Robert was still very much mourning the loss of their first son. Some of the letters from Robert and others from Harriet this period are extremely heart-wrenching and difficult to read. Though Harriet went on to have many healthy living children and experienced no more infant loss, the sadness of losing her first child seemed to remain with both Robert and Harriet for the remainder of their lives. Another son named Conway, a Robert, and lastly a daughter named Mary made up their living family. These children all went on to live healthy and productive lives, and in Richard's case in particular, he was knighted. That's pretty great. One of the most significant events of Harriet's life in this period was when her husband Robert died of consumption in 1843. His health had been in decline for a long time, so the family was at least aware that an early death was a possibility. Dr. Sampson, The surgeon mentioned earlier in connection to the penitentiary and to the asylum was also Robert's personal physician. Dr. Sampson attended the family and did his best to help Robert gain back his strength as he fought the illness all through the year of 1842. Robert even stepped back in his role as a minister, which was his passion in life, to try to heal. Unfortunately, none of these measures could stop the spread of the disease, and Robert passed away peacefully in his bed next to Harriet in their home. This peaceful passing brought Harriet some comfort, according to her letters. Robert also left Harriet a large amount of money, and as a widow, she had a striking amount of control over her life, as she never remarried. Harriet formed an even closer relationship to Robert's twin brother, John, who was devastated by the loss of his brother and constant companion. John became a surrogate father to Harriet's children, and Harriet became one of John's closest confidants. John suffered from the family disease, though, and his health was also in decline. Only 2 years later, in 1845, John Solomon Cartwright passed away and left behind his wife, Sarah, and several children. In his will, John actually named Harriet as one of the guardians of his children, entrusting her to make pivotal decisions in the care and education of his children. Harriet and her sister-in-law, Sarah, for a period, actually ended up combining households, and Sarah took a more prominent role in raising the children, while Harriet doubled down on her volunteering and community involvement. These women were young, but very wealthy widows with over a dozen children between them, and they managed to forge their own place in the Kingston community. And as a final note, Harriet actually thrived well into her 70s and continued with various public volunteering activities up into her last months. This is just a single case study of one instance of a woman volunteering, and it's quite clear that women played a significant role in the early healthcare and moral reformatory institutions in Upper Canada. As a member of the Female Benevolent Society, Harriet was one of many women in 19th century Kingston who went unrecognized for her role in founding, funding, and running KGH. The early days of the hospital heavily relied on voluntary efforts of mostly upper-class women. Though the state eventually took over and largely obscured immense efforts which women put into the institution, these women should not continue to be ignored. Harriet also played a role in the creation of Rockwood Asylum and in the recognition of the categories of mental illness, insanity, and criminality at the Kingston Pen. Even her daily church-based activities, such as Sunday school and the Young Ladies Bible Study, were all examples of how Harriet was involved in changing her community. Not all these actions resulted in a greater good. There were a lot of abuses that happened in the years the Rockwood Asylum was in operation. They did create change, and in some cases, lasting change. The complication that women are often seen as either working and rejecting family life or just living their lives as wives and mothers is something that we encounter a lot in history. But the lived reality of colonial women and women today was that something very different. Harriet was a very complicated person full of hopes, achievements, and disappointments. Harriet Dobbs Cartwright's life had a lasting impact on the Kingston community for generations, and some of that impact can be even seen today. So thank you for your time and questions.
Victoria, thank you for a fascinating and very eloquent talk. It's pretty clear from your research that you haven't succumbed to shapeless idleness. You've been very industrious, and in presenting tonight the story of this fascinating woman, I would like to talk a little bit later, but in the interim, let's open this up to questions. People will want to quiz you on some aspects of what you told us about this fascinating woman. So I would remind you, if you would like to ask a question, there is on the bottom of your screen a reaction button, and you can bring up the hand. I will recognize you, and at that point, would you please unmute? Does everyone understand that? All right, I see Diana Cartwright would like to ask a question. I wonder where this is coming from. Diana, please go ahead.
Hi, Victoria. That was great. I know she's supposed to have been a quite a good painter. Could you share anything about her painting abilities and when she started doing that, etc.?
Yes, yeah. So she was a very accomplished painter, and if you go to the art gallery at Queen's, some of her paintings are on display right now, and some of the others are actually at the National Archives in London, England. She started painting as a child, and in her letter she continues talking about sending paintings. Her family, even when she was in Upper Canada, would ask her to ship paintings from Upper Canada to Ireland because she was so good. So she remained an artist for her whole life. When she became a mother, she wrote a few times how she was a little annoyed that motherhood was interfering with her time to paint. And there are several paintings I included in the slides. Any home looking art, that was her paintings, because she was quite a prolific painter.
Thank you, Diana.
Thank you.
Questions? Jean Baxter, I see you would like to ask a question.
Yes, I have a question. My question has to do with Kingston Penitentiary. I can't remember offhand exactly when Charles Dickens visited, but he described Kingston as half built up and half burnt down, so that gives some sort of context. He was much impressed by the fact that the prisoners in Kingston Penitentiary were learning a trade. I wondered whether the Female Benevolent Society was interested in this sort of thing, in education and teaching a trade, or just in the moral betterment of the criminal class.
That is, it all kind of comes together in this period when it was seen that having a trade and being able to earn your own money and also doing physical labor was in fact a moral reform of itself. So they were very interested in kind of encouraging that behavior. But then things started to almost get out of hand because the prison could make things very cheaply, and then it undermined the tradesmen outside the prison in the Kingston community. So then it became an issue. And so there was a give and take and some frustration, I think, on all sides, because in some cases, the upper class women didn't understand the frustrations of the tradesmen, but they did understand when outside pressure was put on them. Then it became a little messy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean. Questions, please? Paul,
Ian Durant. Okay.
Please unmute.
Victoria, the last picture that you showed, very interesting picture, foreground. I can't place that picture. We're definitely not looking out over to the Kingston Penitentiary, as indicated by the view from Harriet's house. Where were we?
From what I understand, it was farther away, near, I think, where Cartwright Point is now.
Okay.
Which is outside, a little outside of Kingston, but
further west.
I'm not 100% sure.
No, that's
the
an
exact
interesting
location. I pulled it from the archives, and I'm sure there's a note that says exactly where it is, because Margaret Angus, who did all this work, was amazing. I am not so good with remembering some of those details.
That's fine. Very deep
there. Has a question, I believe.
Just on that point, the first one that showed the medical hospital,
yes,
was looking at Cartwright Point. The last one, I believe, Harriet used to paint from the Cartwright house, so that would be looking along King Street back towards the St. George Church.
Not, but inside Portsmouth or west of Portsmouth.
King and Gore Streat, around there.
In town, okay.
I noticed that Sue Beasley probably could elucidate this question if she'd like to. Please unmute.
I can. Yes, the first illustration is of the Garrison Hospital on the back side of the rear side of Point Henry, as you say, looking across to Cartwright Point. And the one of the buildings, the guardhouse, is still in existence. If you drive down the hill, you can see the guardhouse there. The hospital and the dead house and the guardhouse, we did excavate for a number of seasons. The other one is looking out of the upper story window of Cartwright House. You can see Fort Henry, the one that predates this current Fort Henry that we have. You can see that in the background. And interestingly enough, and I was going to ask this question, I don't know if you've come across any information about Harriet's relationship with Frome, who is a military officer, as an artist as well, who worked on the Rideau Canal. And he has the same sketches that apparently he was in, as Jennifer McKendry likes to say, in the upstairs bedroom window of Harriet's house. So I haven't found any information about their relationship, but I wonder if you know anything about that, Victoria, if you've come across that.
Actually, this has been really interesting because there is an artist who in my memory, started with an F, their name. So I'm thinking it's the same person who came to visit, and she commissioned some artwork from them of her children and her household to send to her family. And she was going on and on about how this artist, he was really great. And she was really singing his praises. So I'm wondering if this is the same person. He only is in one letter. But I remember thinking, well, she doesn't usually sing other artists' praises. She's usually quite critical of them. So that's
I'd love to chat with you about the art stuff at some point, if we can do
yes.
that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Another question. Any questions?
Ian Durant.
Ian?
Yeah, so it sounds like she was a woman of many different accomplishments across a variety of different areas. I'm just curious, did you come across anything where she spoke about what she felt maybe her greatest achievement was, or what she was most proud of? And, you know, as well, from your perspective, what do you think was maybe her biggest achievement?
Oof. That's a tough one. She does talk about being she avoids the word pride or proud in the context of anything but her children. I'm sorry if my internet is giving out. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, she avoids the word pride, I think partly due to her Anglican nature. But she takes great pride in her children and running a smooth household, despite everything she does outside the house. And she takes a lot of pride in her poetry, which I haven't included in this talk, in part because it's very lengthy, and in part because it's bad, in my opinion. But she's actually very proud of her poetry and her poetic achievements. So that's a whole other area of her life that I didn't get to talk about here. But she's proud of her art skills.
Questions, please.
Duncan, there's a question from Paul Charbonneau in the chat.
Paul, please go ahead and unmute.
Okay. I was just wondering, you talk about the history of KGH and the society. Has it been acknowledged, the contribution of the society within the KGH history, or is it still somewhat mute on that fact?
It's unfortunately, there's a note, one sentence in the history of KGH on their website, which I do appreciate because it's something, but it really doesn't highlight the years of effort and pushing the community that so many of these women in the Female Benevolent Society put in. So that's a source of frustration for me, because the more I look into it, the more you see what they did, and it's more than a sentence's worth of stuff.
Thank
Victoria,
you.
let me ask you a question. Are you ever tempted to look 100 kilometers to the west down to Belleville and parallel the experience of the Cartwright with that of Susanna Moodie, who's another British woman who comes to the frontier and reinvents her sense of womanhood? And we've had some wonderful books about that by people like Charlotte Gray, etc. Do you see a parallel or a difference here?
There are definitely parallels with Moody's, with the Hargraves and other kind of families with women coming, especially from Scotland and Ireland, to Upper Canada. So yes, I definitely see connections to them. One of the reasons I'm focusing on Harriet is because she's received so much less attention than some of these other women. I mean, Susanna Moodie, like when you think of coming to Upper Canada, you think of her. Or I do. But yes, I think there's a lot of similar experiences, even if there's differences in money and differences in liking or hating your experience. There's this connection of being a woman in a new place. And again, I didn't really get into this, but the first 2/3 of the letter book that these letters are recorded in is actually not about Harriet at all. It's her 2 other sisters' letters. They both went to India, for one to follow her husband and the other met a husband there. So I have this passion project on the side, which is looking at all 3 sisters together and comparing being in India versus being in Upper Canada and these feelings and fears that they all had. But that's post thesis. that's a while down the line.
Any questions?
David Gordon has his hand raised.
David, please unmute.
Hello, Victoria, that was great. And I just reached out and pulled my copy of Margaret Atwood's Alias Grace off the shelf in here. And I wondered if you see Harriet in some of the benevolent ladies in Atwood's book.
So I haven't actually read Alias Grace. I'm a bad Canadian. But I actually encountered the book several times when researching women in the prison, because the woman that the book is based off of was part of the inspiration for some of the separation between insanity and criminality, and the idea is a person fit to stand trial. And the woman that it's based off of was not liked in the prisons because she would bite people and fight people. So it's a very interesting connection, the reality of it. And I would definitely say Harriet would be one of the benevolent women kind of referred to in the book. I'm assuming they had an attitude of moral superiority.
They did, and I'd recommend this to you as a terrific time waster when you're looking to avoid working on your dissertation. It'll be lots of fun for you to read this book. You may also want to contact Professor Brian Osborne, who's a former president of the Kingston Historical Society and was Margaret Atwood's advisor on all things Kingstonian for this, for Ms. Atwood's book. Brian would probably also be a good source for you. He's a historical geographer retired from the Department of Geography and Planning at Queen's.
And thank you. That's one of the great things about this project being local, is that there are so many people who can help me. So I really do appreciate that. And
you are required to talk with Sue Baisley after
yes.
this.
Ian Durant, I see another question. If you'd unmute, please.
Oh, no, sorry, I didn't have another question.
Oh, your hand's up.
And I had.
Vincent.
Yes, yeah, the other one. Very good talk, Victoria, excellent. A couple of things. Have you been in touch with Dr. Sam Short, who wrote Victorian Lunacy? Okay, the title is Victorian Lunacy, and he was, well, he's still in Kingston. He was a family physician, teaches at Queen's, and he wrote this book back in, let's say, the 90s, and it deals a lot with the London asylum and that, but he also would be a good source of information regarding Kingston, the psychiatric hospital here. The other one is the Rockwood Review. Did you come across that?
I have not come across that book in particular.
Okay, it's not a book. It was a bit later, but it was a fortnightly produced by the daughters of Dr. Clark. You know, the Clark Institute. Well, he was here first, and they did this fortnightly, and it just gives you a good social atmosphere of what was going on in the Portsmouth Village area at the time, and also interactions with patients, you know, some of the stuff that went on as far as dinners and pageants and things of that nature you might find of interest. The third thing is, did you come across R.R.F. Harvey?
No.
Okay, I'll send you something because Harriet gave Harvey's father, who taught in the Sunday school for Robert, gave him a couple of, they were drawings, watercolor drawings. One was of St. George's and one was of City Hall. They, for many, many years, were misattributed to Harriet as the artist, which she wasn't, but there was a mix-up that went on there. And I was just wondering if that might be a very interesting sort of other aspect, because as you said, Robert started the Sunday school and she was involved in that. And this would be another tie back also back to Ireland. Yeah.
Yeah, I did read about that mix-up with the illustration of the church.
Right.
And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
The back and forth about, did she paint it? Did she, or draw it?
Yeah, what happened was the 1973 book on the tercentenary, in there they made the mistake. They corrected it in the book on St. George's, but a lot of people didn't read the second one, but did read the first one. So it's understandable that these things happen, but through Paul, I'll connect with you. I have some research I've done on these various things that I'll share with you.
Any further questions?
That would be wonderful.
Any further questions? Dave Gordon again, please unmute. David?
There we go. I'm just putting in the chat for you, Victoria, Jacqueline Duffin, a wonderful Hannah Chair of the History of Medicine at Queen's, recently retired, and she has a history at UT Press of Langstaff, 19th century medical life. So that was, I think, 1993 or so, from University of Toronto Press, and she'd be another good person to talk with about the history of the hospital, history of medicine in Kingston, and women's role in that.
Thank you. I really do appreciate the sources.
Jackie's wonderful. You'll really enjoy talking with her.
Well, before this turns into a doctoral oral defense, and which still lies ahead of Victoria, I might suggest anyone who does have a suggestion for a book or an idea, you could send it to me and I'll make sure Victoria gets it. Now, this has been a real pleasure for us, Victoria. For us aging academics, there is nothing more exhilarating than a doctoral student in full flight of their enthusiasm and their research. It's the best pension we could get, because it's a sense that the next generation is going to be as good and probably better than we were. So in that respect, thank you very much. Make two quick points in listening to your fascinating talk. You said at the beginning that the Cartwrights are a big deal in Kingston, and that's certainly true. I mean, the geography of Kingston speaks to it. Cartwright Point, Cartwright Street, Cartwright House, etc. The history of Kingston is dotted with Cartwrights, and you showed us a very good tree of Roberts, Richards, John Solomon, etc. That construct, though, is very much a male construct. The hat rack of achievement is very much a male one. Judgeships, merchants, politicians, ministers, etc. What you are doing, I think, is very important, because as feminist scholars talk about the need to center the feminine experience in the historical narrative. For so long, women were pushed to the margin. What they did was interesting, it was maternal, but it was the men, as you know, who were seen as the builders. Well, Harriet, you're putting her in the center of Kingston life and giving her real agency, even though it doesn't hang on a kind of formal hat rack of achievement. So I think that's very important what you're doing from a kind of feminist point of view. The second thing I really want to commend you on is writing a biography. In the last 4 or 5 decades, historians have tended to embrace theory and theme, gender, environment, class, race, of course. These are all very important and in many ways need to be uncovered in our history. But go to any bookstore and what is packed on the shelves but biography. And I think what you're going to have here is a wonderful biography, and you've given us a hint that you're aware of gender and class and cultural attitude. But you're making a very interesting woman the center stage here. And I really commend that, and I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a great doctoral thesis. And the nice thing about it is it's going to make a nice book quite easily, I would think, after it. So thank you very much and good luck. We'll be sending you a small thank you gift in the post for your labors, and we'll look forward to keeping track of you and looking forward to your article, which will appear in Historic Kingston. So let me end this evening by reminding our audience that we have, yes, a silent applause from all of us. Thank you very much. Let me remind us, our membership and all those who would like to join us, that our next lecture comes on Wednesday, March the 3rd. The maritime historian Mark Sagan will be joining us to talk about his enthusiasm for lighthouses along the shore of Lake Ontario, and of course their relationship with the graveyard of Lake Ontario. So Mark Sagan, March the 3rd. We look forward to that. And without further ado, I thank you all for coming and thank Jane for her introduction, and wish you good luck once again. Thank you and good night all.